Hey, Vibhor, thank you for coming in. You just have a marvelous background. I mean, you definitely are co-creating and creating and innovating in a way that's transformational for the world. And really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with my audience.
Thank you, Stephen. Very good morning to you, and thank you for having me here. Pleasure to be talking to you.
So, Vibhor, one of the things that my audience always is curious about, and I should mention, my audience, because I break it down, I always, look at the metrics. Number one is like CEO, number two is president, three is board director, it's co-founder, founder of companies, investor, and then it's like professors and experts and things like that. So it tends to really lean forward on that kind of strategic head of companies side. So that's sort of primarily your audience, but a lot of them have a tech background. And then after that would be like medical professionals and so on. But I always get these questions, people love professionals like yourself, amazing scientists like yourself that are doing transformational work. And they're curious, what were the inflection points in your life that made this wonderful career you have? And maybe it was something when you were 5 years old, or 10, inside, outside the family. It could have been mentors. It could be something happened in school or a job. Maybe three magic moments that really defined you.
Wow, that will require me to go and think about my entire life, and giving my failing memory, I'm not sure how good a job I'll do at that. But, if I had to pick out three, the first three that come to mind right now is number one, is when my parents relocated from our hometown to a big city, which was New Delhi, the capital of India. And that I was about 10 or 11 years old at the time. And that was quite a serious, transformational change in my life. Because, going to a big city, trying to settle in, and with all the nuances that come with it, was quite an interesting phase in my life, if I had to, put it mildly. And then, trying to, learn how to present yourself in a big school where you suddenly are in a classroom of 50 to 60 students as opposed to 20 to 25 students that you're used to. And it's highly competitive. It was quite an eye-opener, and it sort of gives a jolt to the system in many ways. So, gets you to do things. So I would put that as number one. Number two was when I actually relocated from New Delhi to England for my higher education. And this was, again, very not dissimilar to the first relocation, but this time I was about 17 years of age. And it was a very, for a very different purpose. Even though it seems similar, it wasn't. It was switching countries, completely different cultures. And also the fact that, you're sort of on your own at this point. You're just at that precipice of being officially an adult, and also having to figure out what you want to do from there on. And then the third one, I would say there are, of course, more than this. But the third one, I'll just club two in here, is when I chose an academic career after my graduation and was selected directly for a PhD program under my boss at the time, Professor Brian Turner, who is highly revered for his histone code hypothesis and his work in epigenetics. Because I learned a lot from Brian, and it really taught me a lot, especially in the context of discipline and the need for focusing on one thing and doing one thing very well. And combined with that was when I moved over from academia to industry for my first startup. And I met my mentor, who was the founder of this startup. He was a serial entrepreneur. This is back in 2009. And that also meant that I moved from London, UK, to San Jose, California. So there's a theme here you can see. It is changing continents and also changing what I was doing. And I think those moments were most transformative because I learned a lot through those changes.
That's really interesting. I mean, India, being raised in that environment, which is now, in fact, I'm an investor and I recommend sort of eyes turning to India with such innovation occurring. I also recommend Africa now as well. But it's interesting to be in that really incubation kind of environment. And in fact, one of my best, I have some great friends in India, and one of them has a conglomerate, and they're big in the medical space, including in the U.S. So it'll be interesting. I'm going to show what you're doing because I'm just thinking there's so many points of connection. But he has one of the largest medical companies in the U.S. as well. So, but it sounds like, and then you go on to get this additional education in the UK, right? And there you get this exposure, and then you go into industry and you become an entrepreneur. Can we mine that entrepreneur sort of journey? Like, what inspired you to become an entrepreneur? Because that's a big leap from going into from research to translational research, and then from translational research to actually producing a solution and scaling it, and, product market fit, all of that, sort of journey. That's a big leap. So.
No, it certainly is. And if I look back, I think all of those transitions were pretty big leaps, at least for me. I find them quite, I think the chasm was quite wide, but it was only because of my teachers and my mentors, and of course my family, that I was able to cross it. I wouldn't say it was smooth, but I guess now these things are. I mean, look, India is, it's a hotbed, for the adage which says necessity is the mother of all inventions. I mean, it's just like you are in this very populous, high voltage, full of energy and chaos, with semblance of methods, which is just unparalleled. And that teaches you a lot. Of course, what you learn depends on the environment as well, within that within that macro sphere. And that's where I said it's largely shaped by people around you. And if I had to pick one thing, what it taught me, it was just that, to appreciate everything that happens for you. I think not to take it for granted. Because you, of course, as you can appreciate, you have to work very hard in India for everything you do. And I think that teaches you the art of appreciating every good thing that happens to you in life. Fast forwarding it to the question you asked about entrepreneurship, my parents, they're medics. And my father's a surgeon, my mother's a gynecologist, and they started their own practice right after med school. This was back in the 70s. So when I was born, I sort of grew up watching them build a business at the crossroads of science and medicine, and that was quite fulfilling. And of course, when you are sent abroad for a higher education, at least for most families, the nirvana is to, get a good education, get a good job, and settle down, at least from where I come. And it was very important for me to just do a little bit more, only because I had grown up seeing that. And I think I was just, wonderful, again, I had some great people around me, both internationally and locally, who were making the most of the positive strides that were being made around us in the world of entrepreneurship. People finding businesses, people coming from all walks of life and thinking big. And it was just, I guess, at the right time when all of this was bubbling up. which was great because it helped me be inspired and brought that inspiration combined with everything that I had seen growing up to fruition.
So, I mean, so you have this kind of roots in entrepreneurship with your parents, right? And then you have this seed that then drives you to do entrepreneurship, and you have this company, Quantum Secure. Can you talk? You spent nearly 7 years building this San Jose company in California, Quantum Secure. Can you tell me what the purpose of that company was? And it got acquired, right, by the HID group. So,
yes, absolutely. So Quantum Secure was providing a software platform, an enterprise-grade software platform for global enterprises to help them ensure that the right people have the right access to the right places. It was just that, but you can imagine it had huge consequences because, if you're if you're a global enterprise, you want to make sure that the right people have access to your data centers, which are very critical areas. If you are a government organization, you want to make sure that your nuclear facilities are protected at all times. And, similarly, the facilities where you store your arms or your arsenal. And similarly, if you are, any other enterprise managing several different physical assets, could be an energy company or a hospital. Again, you just want to make sure that the right people have right access to them at all times. And as an organization, how do you ensure that everybody is complying to the rules that have been defined based on industry regulations or based on your own good practices can be a tall order. It's exactly like how you ensure that the right people have access to the right systems, logically speaking. So it's a very intensive, at least before Quantum was born, it was a very intensive exercise. There were systems in place which allowed people to issue access, through badges or cards, but there was very little by way of ensuring that the right people had right access and compliance. And that's what Quantum came up with. So, as in a product platform which could truly help organizations streamline that process and comply with regulations, and most importantly, save millions of dollars, which they would have otherwise spent on either trying to do this manually or pay in fines for not complying with regulations or their internal good practices, which have led to security breaches, which you can imagine are quite serious. So that's what Quantum was doing. I joined them in 2009 when I met the founder, who was my former mentor as well, and in London during one of their business trips. And they said, look, do you want to learn about the startup world? Do you want to be in Silicon Valley? And those are the only two things I needed to know at that time. and off I went from London to California.
So after it got acquired by the HID group, then did you then found this Pangaea company, or did you have other steps in between?
I did have a few steps in between because I must say I had been thinking about Pangaea for a little while. In fact, it had been quite a long time since I'd been thinking about it. And of course, with all these things, the thought process back then wasn't what it has transpired to be today. But certainly the roots are very much there. But after Quantum was acquired, I worked for HID for a little while, for about a few months or a year post-acquisition. And then I went on to take up a role as a senior vice president at Seven Bridges Genomics, which came out of Harvard. And those guys, I had met them earlier. They were, the founders and a few guys out of Harvard, about 16, I think they were when I'd met them. They were trying to build a platform to allow bioinformaticians to run their analysis of genomic data in a seamless manner. I'm speaking at a very high level. And of course, that resonated very well with me, given that I trained in bioinformatics and I knew the rigmarole of running some of these pipelines and putting them together and I could see the benefits of a platform like that. And the cool thing about that opportunity was it was for me a way to translate everything that I had learned in academia as a bioinformatician and as a scientist or a molecular biologist in Brian's lab, combined with everything that I had learned in quantum, where I grew up to leading that business and building it up, especially in Europe from scratch. In several bridges in a healthcare field. So that was pretty fascinating. I was with them for 6 months, and then right after that, I was appointed CEO of a company that came out of the Science and Technologies Facilities Council in the UK, who I was a CEO for about 6 months. And during that time, or after that time, sorry, we just built Pangaea with my co-founder, Professor Vibhor.
So that's a really fine journey then. I mean, you're studying in this area, you then get involved, you actually get an invite to join Quantum Secure, and it gets acquired, you stay with the HID group as well, so it just increases your experience. You then work with the startup on the genomic side, and it fits your bioinformatics background and so on. It's a natural fit. You end up being a CEO of a UK company. So again, it gives you a top leadership perspective. So you got all the pieces, right? The R&D, the translation, the startup, senior leadership as well, and working with enterprises. And then that is what inspired you to found Pangaea Data, right? So, and it's out of London and San Francisco. So can you talk about Pangaea? I mean, where did the idea come from, and or what inspired the idea, I guess?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. And I wish I had planned my journey that way, and I could take credit. But at least it just worked out that way. And you're quite right. If I look back, everything that we did, helped us with a purpose, both then in the short term and also in the long term, as we are finding out now. So yes, I'm very grateful to the Almighty for that. And Pangaea was really brewing with me since my PhD days, because I was, just to give you context, in Brian Turner's lab, my job was to assess the efficacy of 3 compounds, which were histone deacetylase inhibitors in the context of acute myeloid leukemia, which is a form of blood cancer. So essentially, we were studying if epigenetic changes introduced by these chemical compounds in cancers can help with remission in these patients, and we were trying to understand its science. So it involved me learning everything we needed to learn in molecular biology, and doing experiments myself in the lab, and also then generating data and writing my own code to analyze that data. Now, I'm sure that this is 2024, and there are a lot more clever coders around, including my colleagues here in Pangaea. So I wouldn't count myself as an expert, but at least back in the day, it was good enough for what we needed to do. And then finally, it was inferring that data and making sure it was actually leading us to understand the science behind the actionability of these compounds to help patients and work with patients. So we were working with physicians who were attached to Brian's lab, and we were working with patient data, anonymized, of course, and trying to bridge that that gap between the science on the bench and what happens with the patient on the bedside. So truly translational work. And during that exercise, we recognized that there's a lot of patient data available, especially in the Western world. Bear in mind, this is 2004. So electronic health record systems are not mandated legally, at least the high-tech regulation has not come into play. But certainly hospitals, large hospitals, especially in the US and in the UK, have started to deploy these systems and capture patient information electronically. And when you look at that information, you're, as a bioinformatician doing your PhD, you're having to, go through all that information yourself. And you have some tools at your disposal with very limited medical knowledge. You're just, you're an early starter, and you're just trying to get to grips with it. And it was at that point I realized that there surely has to be a better way to process all this information so that it's made actionable at the point of care for physicians. Did we know how to do that? No. Because, every time we talk to the physicians, it would be like, well, we still have to go through the records. It's our responsibility. And it made all the sense in the world. But of course, in 2018, I recognized that by then these, number one, EHR systems were very widespreadly, very widespread, at least in the US and in the UK and some other parts of the world like Japan. And the data volumes were just growing significantly. By one estimate, I read a Gartner report, I think at the time, and they were growing at like 40% year on year, the data volumes. So this was pretty serious, where you had all this data available for patients with a lot of information, and where, fast forward from 2004 to 2018, physicians were saying, well, there is just no way we can go through all this information at the point of care, because if we did, it would take us 30 to 40 minutes with each patient, which we simply don't have. And that was the point when we said, well, now is a good opportunity to perhaps see if we can use mathematics and computing to help solve this problem.
So that's really, really interesting. And even in the early days on the epigenetic aspects, right? And the sort of the interaction of compounds and so on. Later on, I want to see if I could go back to that, maybe on the longevity side with David Sinclair and some of the work that's being done at Otos Labs with Yamanaka, which the epigenetics aspect, but if we have time. So that's really, really fascinating. So you found this company and you're using mathematics and some kind of machine learning aspect in there somewhere, I imagine. Are you looking at generative AI as well, or do you think that's just not quite there yet?
So given the purpose of Pangaea, which is to find more untreated or undertreated patients who are otherwise hidden in plain sight, in spite of information being available in the records, simply because they might be being treated for other conditions or for administrative reasons, it's just, they're not being found. By the way, which transpires into about 90% of the patient population across thousands of hard to diagnose conditions. Given that purpose, we had to start with, number one, mimicking what a physician does manually to find such patients, right? So does a physician look through symptoms and comorbidities in the patient record? The answer to that was no. From physicians, that's when we talked to them. They said, we can't just look for keywords using natural language processing, because if we did that, then the number of patients we will find is going to be humongous and the accuracy is going to be very poor, because the symptoms and comorbidities can be common across multiple conditions. So then we zeroed in on the idea, well, what would you do in the clinic that would make sense and make this explainable? And the answer was clinical guidelines that physicians have to follow. And therefore, we came up with a methodology, and this is all credit goes to my co-founder, Professor Guo, who's really the engineer on the team, where they came up with the science to configure algorithms based on these guidelines and then process electronic medical record data based on that configuration, which allowed us to find more such untreated patients. And the number of patients we were finding were not like 10, 20% more. In certain conditions, we were finding 20 times more patients compared to if you would have been looking for them based on metadata-based searches like ICD codes. In some cases, we were in ultra rare and rare conditions, we were finding 5 to 6 times more patients. So this was quite significant. Now, having said that, you can imagine to do this work, you need physicians on your team, which is what we have in Pangaea, who would inform us of what clinical guidelines to use, because clinical guidelines typically can be hundreds of pages, and it's mathematically translating them into an algorithm is not, it's not trivial. So you need physicians to tell you which part, of the guidelines are important, and et cetera. And then most importantly, validate the output and results. So we feel we have been doing a lot of that in Pangaea. And more recently, we feel that large language models can lend us the ability to fast track this entire process I have described even further. So today it takes us about 8 to 10 weeks to do what I've just described, which is phenomenal compared to 9 to 12 months, which is what it would take if we were doing this organically using just NLP and some kind of reasoning or modeling. So we already have a big leg up. But with LLMs, we are finding we can reduce this time even further, and most importantly, make it easier for on several other aspects for the physician at the point of care. So this is all R&D I'm talking about. In comparison to some of the large language models that are available today, we are currently using smaller versions so that they can be deployed behind the firewall of these health systems, so that no data is touched or moved by Pangaea or anyone else, because data is sacrosanct, as you can imagine. But as we do this more R&D with LLMs, we're excited about the opportunities. And in fact, Professor Guo has set up a big generative AI facility in Hong Kong, where he's the president of Hong Kong Science and Technology University, to just continue this R&D, which we are very excited about.
That's really interesting. There's a tremendous amount of real-time data, but also stored data, medical data and things like that, right? And then these sort of clinical guidelines that you mentioned, and using these, there's some really interesting ideas in there. And, what's the nature of sort of like the false positives and the false negatives? Can you give some kind of metrics there at all?
Absolutely. So we did this work in cancer cachexia with the NHS in the UK, working with 2 physicians out of Edinburgh. And in a data set of about 60,000 patient records, we helped them find 6 times more cancer patients who were cachectic but completely missed previously. Meaning, if you as a physician looked at the patient record, you would say, based on the guidelines, these patients are definitely cachectic, meaning they've had significant muscle loss and weight loss. But if you also look in the same record, there's absolutely no metadata or, suggesting that the patients are cachectic, which means they would completely be missed for care. So we found such patients, and the physicians showed, when they did a manual review of all the patients we found, that I think the accuracy was around 92% to be precise. We have just got a manuscript which is submitted for publication to a peer-reviewed journal. And so you can see it was using this approach of combining clinical guidelines with reasoning, which allowed us to achieve that kind of accuracy. We've had similar results in other prevalent conditions in pulmonology, nephrology, and as I said, in more rare and ultra-rare conditions as well. And more importantly, we talk about the science here, but if you just look at it from an economic standpoint, these physicians we were working with, they showed how finding such patients helps them halve the cost of treatment from 10,000 to 5,000 pounds in these patients. And according to their health economic study, they hypothesize about 200,000 such patients to be discovered in the UK annually through this approach, who are otherwise missed. So you can imagine, if you just do the maths, that's about £1 billion in savings, which, of course, for a public health system like the NHS means now you can, number one, you have empirical evidence to justify the need for more nutritionists or resources in the system. And number two, because you can show economic benefit, you can convince, you can build a business case of enabling that. So we're finding that quite powerful right now. And just caveat there, more than 90% of our work happens in the US with private health systems, where what I've just described holds exactly true, because they are all about managing and optimizing their resources, because these patients otherwise will show up later on.
Yeah, or you have this situation even for hospitals, which is it's an additional kind of ability to add additional care, which helps on the bottom line for hospitals themselves, right?
Exactly, especially when you already have the data for these patients.
That's right. Yeah, I can see the value here, and the time saving, because you're applying some of this kind of more reasoning aspects of LLMs, which is just going to get better. Um, have you the ability then to test some of the more advanced models that are still being sort of behind the curtain and being tested with small groups, like the next edition of the next generation of these LLMs that can do sort of independent research, a little bit more autonomous? You can give them a longer project time frame to work on a particular target area, things like that. Do you have that kind of access, or are you working with the ones that are sort of already available to most organizations?
Oh, we have just published in JAMIA, which is the Journal of American Medical Informatics Association, our paper where we have benchmarked several of these large language models against each other in the context of finding more patients with COPD, which is a pulmonological condition, chronic kidney disease, HSV, and primary biliary cholangitis. And we have discussed the aspects you were talking about in that paper extensively, where we have shown that these large language models have a huge potential, but then there are some areas to watch out for, hence the need for more R&D. Yeah.
So do you have now then, do you have a situation where you've got deployments where people are actually using it commercially now?
So people are already using Pangaea's product right now, both in the healthcare and also in pharma, because you can imagine in pharma, their biggest concern is if only 1 to 2 out of every 10 patients are receiving the care because the other 8 to 9 are still untreated or getting lost in the system in spite of the data being there. That's a big problem for them. So we do have pharma and healthcare both using the product as it was based on the current stack. And like I said, we are building onto that stack and doing more R&D in the context of imbibing some of these latest technologies, both in AI and, of course, in general, in infrastructure. Because you can appreciate the medical and the AI part is one part of it, but the process engineering is very important. How do you integrate with the electronic health record system so you can read and write back to them so the physicians don't have to do any extra work? How do you integrate with the scheduling systems so that the patients can be scheduled in for a review once they are found without much heavy lift for the nursing staff or the administrative staff, and so on and so forth. So that is ongoing, and we have some exciting results to demonstrate that. But we're very proud about our collaborations with our partners like Microsoft, who are helping us accelerate that work.
I mean, there are some states in the U.S. that are more integrated in a sense, are more sort of data aware and the benefits of doing this kind of work. So I think Michigan is maybe one of them. Are there others that you're aware of? Are you working with some of the more advanced states? No.
So we started off, of course, in states like St. Louis, in North Carolina, in California, in Massachusetts. Not to name any of them, and also in Illinois. So you can probably guess the large health systems in these states when we started out, or have started out. But of course, we are seeing that it's not, the starting point doesn't have to be determined by the maturity of the technical infrastructure. And this is precisely because our partners like Microsoft have made that transition to upgrade infrastructure so easy, relatively speaking, that as long as the business case makes sense, it is a low lift for IT teams. What it all comes down to, in our experience, is the motivation of the physicians themselves, where the physicians are saying, look, we want to do what's best for our patients, especially if we have the information about them. But we understand we're not, we have limited budget, even though we would love to do AI and we are doing AI, there's a limit to how much we can do and how much we can do in what sort of time. So how can we accelerate? How can we recognize the benefits of applying technology, which is only a means to an end, for the benefit of patients faster, as opposed to waiting for the nirvana where everything is hunky-dory, all the data is harmonized, all the systems are talking to each other. And, it's a beautiful world.
So do you have plans? I mean, you're, as you indicated, sort of really centered in the U.S., but you're a founder of London and it says London and South San Francisco-based Pangaea Data. So you're working with the UK health system, right?
Correct. And of course, like I said, more than 90% of our work happens in the US, which is why I spend a lot of my time at our office in South San Francisco. Yeah.
Well, how about the European health systems, the Canadian? Are you looking at other regions around the world potentially after you get sort of a solid foothold, and let's say in the UK, but also in the American marketplace, and of course, right now you're concentrated on the US, and that's the biggest healthcare system in the world, right? So but the biggest upside is there first, but then you can scale it to India, or your original home country, right, or other areas.
Absolutely. So thanks to our customers and partners, we're already entering into Spain and France in Europe, and also in Japan and China, which is offering us a lot of insight for those reasons. It's very early days in these countries, candidly, compared to where we are in the US and in the UK. But the feedback we're getting from these countries is very positive, touch wood, because I again go back, because the motivation of the physicians is practically the same. How do you do best for the patients based on existing data? And for the CFOs at these institutions, how do you get a return on your investment that you've made in this large infrastructure over and beyond it just being a billing system?
In your analysis then of the clinical guidelines, and then also the data, the health records and so on, are you also looking at images like CT scans and MRIs and things that are missed?
We work with our partners who do that. So we are laser focused right now on processing patient records which come in textual form, so which include both structured and unstructured data. But our partners certainly, because you see, once we have found those patients who are untreated or undertreated, they need to go through either some kind of screening because they haven't been even diagnosed. So the screening would involve a radiological or a pathological exam or a genomic exam, and then the results of which will be processed by several other companies who I'm sure you've heard of, who take input in the form of images from those scans. And then secondly, our product is being deployed to process patient records of patients who are already diagnosed, which is very true in oncology. So the physicians can then determine who of these diagnosed patients are suitable for a post-diagnostic review of some sort. And that could involve a comprehensive genomic profiling test, or that could involve any other kind of review.
Underneath that, you can find the Microsoft Founder Startups Hub, and they can sign up for it.
Apply once you are a member of Microsoft for Startups Founders Hub, I think, but don't quote me on that. Microsoft would be best placed to inform us. But then once you do apply, there's a very, demanding process, and rightly so, where Microsoft really go in depth into your technology, into your business, into your personal profiles, just to vet and make sure that you as a business are worthy of their attention through this Pegasus program. Because like I said, it's all about the people, and the people involved in running that program are very serious, very lovely people, and they really give it their all to help you. So I guess they just want to make sure that you are the right fit.
Yeah, I guess I would recommend the audience just to take a look. I maybe invite only. So once you're in the program, and then Microsoft is sort of monitoring those that they want to support even further, which they feel show great potential, right? And you met that bar showing great potential. And so, as you mentioned, you get all sorts of additional support, and which is being very helpful. And you indicated it compares very favorably against other incubator accelerator programs as well, because it's such an embracing, empowering, and you get so many capabilities and access once you're in the Pegasus program. So it's good to hear from a Pegasus company and realize you met that requirement to get that additional sort of attention from Microsoft, which is a good attention to get because it's Microsoft, right? So we only have a few minutes left. I'm just going to ask one sort of question on trends, and then we'll close the interview. You have this background in epigenetics, right? And sort of the effect of compounds on epigenetics, and you and bioinformatics. Do you ever look at the work of Yamanaka and or David Sinclair or Altos Labs and this idea that and it's related, right? It's not directly sort of to you what you're doing, but I would say it's very close to what you're doing. And that is that there's information stored in epigenetic effects in DNA methylation, for example. If you can manage some of that, then you can maybe manage aging. And then if you look at Yamanaka's work, right, Yamanaka four factors where you give it to a cell and you can regress it to a pluripotent stem cell. And the idea is that if you could stop it somewhere within that journey, then you can do some rejuvenation or kind of de-aging. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is it just too unrelated to what you're working now? So
I certainly do. In fact, thanks to my boss, Brian Turner, who had a collaboration with Professor Rudy Yenish at the Whitehead at MIT. I almost worked for Professor Yenish after my PhD. But I chose to move to San Jose, as I shared earlier, regrettably in one way. But yes, so I'm very familiar with the work around induced pluripotent stem cells that was championed in the Yamanaka lab in Japan and also at the Yenish lab at MIT. Look, we were studying post-translational histone modifications in Professor Turner's labs, and this was very close to our heart. In fact, it was our lab that published a paper in Nature Genetics around compact chromatin immunoprecipitation, which was how do you precipitate chromatin from embryonic stem cells. So you can imagine the implications of that were huge, especially in everything we do in IPS or in embryonic work. So scientifically and philosophically speaking, I do have my views. I don't think they're that educated to be shared publicly yet, because I haven't really done much work on it for a better part of 15 years or more. But I have been watching very closely the work of Professor Yamanaka and Hal Barron at Altos and a few others. And very keen to see what comes out of it, because aging as the whole work on aging is will tell us a lot about even therapeutics. How do you treat certain kinds of diseases, especially like cancers? What the mechanisms might be, molecularly speaking. A lot of that is analogous to how we look at aging in many ways. But again, like I said, my knowledge is pretty rusty right now. So I wouldn't be, calling myself an expert to comment on it. But very much as an outsider now, I am watching that very closely and with intrigue.
So we're down to about a minute left. So I'm going to ask one final question. What recommendation or questions do you want to leave the audience?
Recommendation-wise, I will share the same recommendation that I've heard countless times through the various transformations I've gone through, including from my co-founder. And in terms of a question, it would be, I would love, because when you're building a company, you're just so heads down that you rarely get the opportunity to see, what else is going around, even though you try your best. So it'll be lovely, Stephen, this is a question for you and the community at large. If there's a way for us founders to be connected.
Yeah, there's the IEEE entrepreneurship program and the ACM. We're sort of in the early stages of that on entrepreneurship. So there is a community building program. And YPO, the Young Presidents Organizations, for those like yourself who've had some success, you may qualify. I would say it's worth it to look at it. So anyways, I just wanted to give some feedback, and then great questions, great advice. And thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insights with our audience.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be with you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.